Hi, Misha here, and a few days ago I laid out the capital ships, the command ships, in Eaglemoss's official collection of diecast models from the Battlestar Galactica, both the original series and the reimagined, re-envisioned series. That was kind of a fleet layout. So I figured tonight I'd put the fighters on the table. I've got 6 of them here, so actually enough to make a squadron, or half a squadron rather. 3 Colonials and 3 Cylon. Over here we have the Viper from the original series, kind of retroactively known as the Mark I. Next we have the most famous, the Mark II. Followed by that we have the most modern, the Mark VII Viper. All these are Colonial Vipers. Over here we have the original Cylon Raider from TOS series, of course. This was a fighter, but it also could double as a bomber or a drop ship. It's pretty large too, at least compared to the Viper. Here we have the most recent of these. This is the Cylon Raider from Blood and Chrome, which is basically a transitional model. And here we have the reimagined Raider, the one we've probably seen the most of, and the second issue in the entire collection. And as you can tell, kind of the biggest and most sprawling of them. And this is just kind of looking back at these just for fun, like the first one. I figured, nah, why not? And I know how some of you love how I stroke these. Oh yeah. Honestly, if you find me doing that sexual, that's more of an issue with you than me, because I'm fucking blind, and how do you think blind people see things? And we're not just gonna, ham-fisted, with hard fingertips. That's a good way to break stuff. So, yeah, this is how blind people touch things. I actually find it pretty amusing, frankly. I'm not one of those people. The whole, quote-unquote, offended or offense thing is silly to me. Especially when people don't intend to do it. If someone unintentionally says something, I don't take it to heart. And if they intentionally do, a lot of the times I just kind of play with them, because I kind of like fucking with them a little bit. It brings me enjoyment a little bit. But, yeah. Yeah, the original Viper. And what was neat about the reimagined series, they integrated the original designs. Not in primary roles, which is good, but they gave them kind of cameos. For example, this is seen in the Galactica Museum. So we can assume that in the reimagined universe, this was the Mark I Viper. Now in the original series, this was their starfighter, just the Viper. It's really the only colonial starfighter we see. It is not FTL capable. It has 2 laser torpedo launchers or guns. They didn't really really quite make up their mind sometimes on that show. Standard crew of 1, although a 2-seat version seems to be at least on offer according to Galactica 1980 and a few other things. There's also a recon or long-range patrol version that has twice the range but doesn't have the guns. This is capable of flying in an atmosphere or in space. It has the 3 classic engines in the back with the 3 wings. This is what kind of started the whole Viper aesthetic. I don't believe, even in the original series, even though they were doing lasers and stuff, that these were shielded. Now, the Galactica from the original series was shielded. But yeah, this was the standard fighter. Not a whole lot to say about it because we only had 1 season, 1 series of that show. Okay, let's just be honest. It was their take on an X-Wing. Hey, I'm not knocking them. They had enough of their own tone and stuff, but when it came to a lot of the space combat, it was very heavily inspired by Star Wars. And this was their take. Instead of 4 wings, it has 3. Instead of 4 guns, it has 2. And no R2 unit. Although I did have a flight computer in the show. Kind of had a database. In the reimagined universe, we can assume that it did not have lasers, that it had cannon, or machine guns, and that it could also carry missiles or bombs on external hardpoints. It can also be said that this was kind of the early Viper, and it was meant more of a anti-piracy craft. It maybe wasn't necessarily built in the re-envisioned universe specifically for the Cylon War. That it was also more computerized, more advanced. We know that from Caprica that they were much more advanced before the war, before they kind of intentionally regressed their technology to keep the Cylons from taking advantage of it. So it's actually possible this was technically a more advanced craft in some ways, but also more vulnerable. It's also possible that it was less of a space superiority, air-to-air, space-to-space dogfighter, and more of a police or interdictor type craft. But it would give way, either before or during the first Cylon War, to the Mark II. This was the backbone of the Colonial Fleet for the first 10 years of the Cylon War. It would start to be replaced by the slightly larger, more powerful Mark III after the first 10 years, but it would still very much be in service and probably even production through the entire war. And then was retired afterwards. This was as simple as the Colonials could make a starfighter. It did have a flight computer, but a pretty basic one. Absolutely no networking, no Wi-Fi, so sorry for your iPhone. It had mostly analog gauges and readouts and controls in the cockpit. Very primitive, kind of a very World War II aesthetic going on. Its primary armament were 2 30mm cannon or machine guns with 800 rounds each, and it could also carry up to 8 Lightning Javelin missiles, and the Javelin missile could either have a conventional warhead or a nuclear-tipped warhead. Speaking of nuclear-tipped, this little fighter was powered by a small nuclear reactor, a nuclear cell, kind of like modern deep space probes we've sent out like Voyager. So it's actually not at all beyond the realm of scientific knowledge even today. It too, like the Mark I, has 3 engines in the back. And it can do atmospheric combat. And of course would be launched from tubes on Battlestars. But yeah, it's just the classic, and this is allegedly Starbucks. Moving on, the Mark VII. This was adopted long after the Armistice. It's the most advanced Viper in the Colonial fleet. Much more streamlined design. Still has the tri-engine set up in the back. It has a much more powerful, more capable central flight computer. Its cockpit is pretty much all digital electronic readouts with very few analog gauges, and those just for backup. It's a sleeker craft, better performance. It has 3 30mm cannon as opposed to 2, and we can assume it has more rounds on board. It too can also carry javelin missiles and other pods and whatnot under the wings. But yeah, this was the frontline fighter before the fall. Interestingly, its cockpit is based on the F-16, the real-world plane, which itself was kind of nicknamed over the years the Viper, based on this design. So kind of a full circle there. This would be primarily, we kind of see Lee Odama flying these. When the fall happened, most Mark VIIs were destroyed by the backdoor Cylon program. Galactica would have around 8 on board when it would flee the colonies, and these would have their computer systems retrofitted to patch the hole in the security. As you know, the Mark IIs would be on board Galactica, 40 of which were intended for a museum display, so a full squadron, full wing. But of course, since these had the more primitive electronics, they were not susceptible to the Cylons. So basically we can say that Galactica had under 50 Vipers when it fled the colonies. Eesh. And as far as we know, they did not have any working Mark Is. The Mark I would be 28 to 29 feet long. The Mark II was a little bit smaller at about 27.5 feet. And the Mark VII was the longest of them all at a little over 32 feet. That said, these all could be launched from the same tubes, meaning they all kind of had a certain nominal commonality. The same with the Mark II and Mark VII and their ammunitions. Both could fire the same cartridges. So it seems like, even though they would advance it, the Colonials did have a standard for their Vipers, which is pretty neat. Well, what about the Cylons and their Raiders? So, this was the Raider, the one we saw in the original series. And it was also seen in war flashbacks from the first Cylon War and Reimagined. In the original series, it fired lasers, of course, and delivered energy bombs or energy missiles. In Reimagined, it had 2 triple-barrel, kind of Gatling-style machine guns or cannons, and it could carry under the wings more conventional missiles or bombs. In both instances, it had a crew of 3, 2 in the front, controlling it, and then 1 kind of commander pilot behind them. Kind of reminiscent of the Apollo capsule in a way. It also had ability to deliver assault troops. And it was pretty big. It was 40 to 45 feet front to back, and 50 to 55 feet wingtip to wingtip. It had big old engines in the back. These were not FTL capable. They have a very interesting cockpit kind of grill. And this is the only one we saw in the original series. But in Reimagined, we also had this variant appearing later in the First War. And because it was only in blood and chrome, we basically know nothing about it. We can assume it has very similar stats, just more improvements. I mean, the real-world explanation for why it exists is to give a transition point to this version, which we saw in the miniseries for the first time. And it seems like that was the first time the Colonials were seeing this version 2, meaning it should be a relatively new make, kind of the analogous to the Mark VII Viper. Still considered a Raider. It has 2 cannon here, which appear to be of a larger caliber than on the Colonial Vipers. We do know that they're a different caliber. These big old wings. Unlike other ones we've seen, this actually has internal weapons or bomb bays, and it can carry either standard missiles or conventional bombs or nuclear. And it is different in several ways. For one, this is the only one on the table that we know for sure is FTO capable. And not just FTO capable, but quite long range FTO capable. So, good. For another, it does not typically have a pilot. It is, in its own way, an independent entity. Kind of a biomechanical machine. It has its own brain that's been likened by the Cylons themselves to a pet, a dog. So an intelligent but still lower life form animal. And it can take advantage of resurrection technology. And is very ooey gooey inside. So for those that didn't like me, touching Vipers, thinking that was weird and sexual, imagine just stroking a Raider, knowing that it's bio-organic and fleshy and pulsing. Also dusty. I've had a lot of construction in my house, so a lot of stuff's dusty lately. We do know that the brain, as it is, does require oxygen to live. We know this when Starbuck captures and kind of lobotomizes the Raider that becomes a scar. And despite its benefits of FTL and whatnot, they don't seem to be as clever a pilot as Colonials. It seems like Colonials, one-on-one or even two-on-one, the Raider is still outclassed by even an average Colonial pilot, and a good pilot like Starbuck or Apollo can take on more than a couple and have a reasonable expectation of a victory. Then we just don't know as much about the Cylon ships, which is how it should be with enemies. We really don't know anything about the size of the transitional Raider. This is about a little over 29 feet. So bigger than the Mark I or Mark II, but it's slightly shorter than the Mark VII. It's worth pointing out, as I said in the other video, a Cylon base ship, base star, will carry nearly 800 of these. And it's its primary defense. Nearly only defense, frankly. So yeah, just having kind of fun visiting the history. I've been doing, of course, a lot of videos on real-world fighter jets and planes and things. So it's kind of fun to approach these with the simmer, because the Battlestar Galactica universe tries to use at least reasonably realistic science and physics. And while they're not like a ship-based series, it's all based on the people, they do focus on the ships and tend to have them internally consistent. I think that's why we don't see as many vessels in the show. They'd rather have a few that they really kind of figure out the pros and cons of. And again, while they don't focus on them, they are important to the series. So they do get reasonably well fleshed out. At least they're not like the miracle shuttles from Voyager that tend to respawn every time they reset the clock and go to a new day on Voyager. They have a count. For example, again, early on, we mostly see Galactica using Mark IIs, with just a few Mark VIIs flying around. But then after Pegasus, we see more and more Mark VIIs, and then through attrition, as we see more and more pilots following Mark IIs be shot down, very few Mark IIs are seen by Season 4. There are still a few left, so not all 40 were done. But they do nicely handle the transition over. Not only did Pegasus herself have dozens, maybe hundreds of Mark VIIs on board, it had a manufacturing facility where it could take raw resources from asteroids and stuff and refine them into Vipers. And they said they did make 2 squadrons and that they were at full strength. So they actually talked about the source of the materials for these and building them. And it is a relatively simple craft. I mean, it has very simple avionics. It has cannon, mostly. It doesn't rely on missiles, and cartridges are easy enough to build. In other words, I believe it. I could see a ship, because even modern aircraft carriers have fabrication facilities, and they can't make, FA-18s, F-35s, but they can make smaller things. So something as advanced as a spaceship could make a relatively small and svelte craft. Obviously, Cylons grow their Raiders. I don't believe that base ships grow Raiders. I believe they get transferred there. But on the other hand, they are resurrected, so we would assume they come from their own resurrection hub or whatever. I would assume the bodies, the ships, the aircraft are ready to go spacecraft, and then the brain is melded with them. They never really get into that, again, which is fine. They don't need to, especially them being the adversary for the first, at least 3 seasons. But, just, talking. So, unlike I said, Voyager, they tried to have some consistency, which means when it comes to doing models like this, even though these were CGI, and they did update the CGI. For example, the Mark VII got a little facelift. I think it was in Season 3 when they improved it a bit, gave it a little better detailing and whatnot. But it's still, it's okay. It doesn't hurt anything, as it were. The Raider also got an upgrade, I think at the beginning of Season 4. But we can understand that from a real-world production point of view. Now, the Mark I, of course, really would be a physical miniature. They had a couple of different scales for the original series. Same for the original Raider. Now, when I first started getting the Galactica series from Eaglemoss, I was primarily interested in the base stars and battle stars. But when I got in, I think they were at issue 3. So, yeah, 1 battle star and 2 planes. So with that in mind, I grabbed a Mark II. And the day it came in the mail, a piece of not good news also came in the mail. So I was actually glad this came in to give me something. And I was immediately struck with the size of the Mark II and also how weighty it is. These are die-cast models, but that, the small things like the guns are going to be plastic. But this thing is almost all metal. The fuselage. They even give it a rudimentary but still existent cockpit with a kind of a clear, smoky plexiglass windscreen. It's just very impressive feeling. Very, very heavy. The Mark I, which came out sometime later in the collection, isn't far off. It too is quite impressive. Not quite as heavy, but still a lot of metal. And then, of course, this here Raider is massive. Now, lengthwise, it's really not that much longer, but because the wings sprawl out, it's pretty something. And the wings are all metal. Of course, the part of the head is plastic, as are the guns, and some of the undercarriage. But it is, I don't know if it weighs more. No, I think it still weighs less than the Viper, for one reason. As big as it is, like a pancake, it's also quite flat. So, still a very impressive model. I think, yeah, this one surprised me the most in how much I liked it. Except trying to find shelf space for it. So, ranking them. I'm going to say my favorite, all things considered, construction, appearance, everything else. Honestly, and I know I'll be in the minority on this, I would say the Mark VII, but, and I'll get back to the but in just a minute. So since I don't think it's my number 1, I'm going to make the Mark I my number 1. It's just a very neat model, very classic sci-fi from the 70s and 80s reruns. Very heavy duty metal. I also like the stand it comes with. A lot of these just kind of sit in the stand and they're not going to fall off, but this one actually kind of does peg in a little bit. It's the most secure. It's not going anywhere. I just think they hit it out of the park with this one. So I'm going to say the Mark I Viper is my first choice. And the Mark it's tough. The Mark II and the Mark VII. Okay, I'm going to give it to the Mark VII next. I know a lot of people don't like the design, but I do because it shows progression. The reason it's not my number one, I was really looking forward to this, and I'm not disappointed. But it seems a little small. I wish they'd done it up a little bit bigger. Because it's more curvy. It's less metal. It's a little lighter than the others because they needed to use more plastic to get the more delicate details in. I mean, the body's still metal. It's just because it's such a thin, tapered body. So if it were a little, it's like 10% larger and a little heavier, I think it might be my number one. I like the bubble cockpit. I like the tri-gun system. And I like that it is different from that. And I don't think anyone else has done a Mark VII, at least not en masse. After that, I'm actually going to give it number 3 to the original Cylon Raider. I just think they hit it out of the park with this thing. It is heavy. It might be, I think it is the heaviest of all of them. This thing is all metal. The only plastique with a little cannon. And part of the engines. But everything else is chunky. Plus it sits on the stand very well. And I don't know, I just think it's neat. After that, I'm going to give it to the Mark II. I know it's going to piss some people off because a lot of people love them. And I do. I like all these. But it's my fourth choice because it is a little boxier, a little clunkier. I know it's intentionally meant to be that way. I know. Kind of reminiscent of a World War II. But, yeah, especially the way the canopy is. I like the canopy on the other two Vipers more. Still really like it. Again, I think the weight and everything is really nice on this one. But plus it's Starbucks. Number 5 goes to the Blood and Chrome. It's not higher because it's just not as iconic, but I think it's super cool that they did such a weird one. This is the first out of the 13 issues they've done. It's kind of out of left field. All the other issues have been very standard. This one's like, okay, cool, but it just, yeah, I don't know. It's just like, why'd they do it? It must have been someone else's favorite. Also, it's lighter. It's probably the lightest of all these on the table. It does still have good metal, but I think because, again, the detailing, and I like weight. And it's a little bit wobbly on its stand. Not bad, but a little bit. And that means number 6 is the re-envisioned Raider. That's not to say I hate it. I think the size is great. The weight's good. It's such a odd design. I don't know. I feel like these wings don't really do anything. I guess they're internal storage or maybe part of the FTL drive, but I don't know. And it's the most organic. I guess it's the only one here that's truly organic. The other Cylons are still mechanical. And I've never just been a huge fan of organic looking ships. I like more angles and lines of mechanics. Just personal preference, though. That and the stand, the way the front kind of rests in it, is kind of chintzy. It can get knocked off, especially the way these stick out front so far. If these get bumped back, it can slip off the stand quite easily because it's just cradled under the head. It doesn't go behind at all. But since this was only issue 2, one thing I've noticed with any of these, it seems like they've learned making better stands as they've gone on with this collection, because the first couple were not horrible, but they just kind of sat there, meaning they could get knocked off easily enough. Yeah, it's just my 2 cents and kind of a little history of each of these, just for fun. Well, if you have any questions or comments, please do post them below. And if you could, like, share, and subscribe. And I'll do one more of these, looking at the last 2 ships in the series, the Raptor and Colonial 1, which again, this, I've already done videos on them, but why not revisit them? Talk a little more about them. I have fun doing these. They relax me, so I hope you enjoyed them. Or maybe you really enjoy them. Which, go get a tissue? I don't know. Yeah. I don't know, yeah. Alrighty, guys. I appreciate you. If you could, like, share, and subscribe. And I'll catch you very soon next time.